Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to today's seminar hosted by the International Inequalities Institute at LSE. My name is Michael Vaughan. I'm a Levy Hume Early Career Fellow at the International Inequalities Institute, and I'm really delighted to be here in today's seminar titled POLINEQUAL: Exploring Representation of Economic Inequality and Their Implications in 3 European Welfare Regimes, which is part of the IAI Inequalities Seminar Series. Today's speakers are Professor Sonja Zmerli and Daniel Walsh. Sonja is a professor at Grenoble, UGA, and principal investigator on the POLINEQUAL project. Daniel is a postdoctoral research fellow at Grenoble, UGA. As usual, there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end of the presentation, and we'll take questions from both the online audience. I'll now hand over to Sonja and Daniel. Many thanks, and enjoy the event.
Okay, thanks so much for, first of all, inviting us here to this inequality seminar. We are very pleased and really honored also to share with you our research results so far. The title, this is not a coincidence, is called an interim tour d'horizon. So meaning particularly the interim tour d'horizon that we also clearly we would like to share our results so far with you. But we are also very much looking forward to your input that may or may not really also steer our follow-up research in specific directions. So we are very much looking forward also to the exchange. Thanks also, Michael, for this very nice introduction and having networked with us at the ECPR General Conference where we bumped into each other, and I think for the better, well, at least for us. Well, of course, I was also looking at the Inequalities, International Inequalities Institute seminar, or the Institute as such, and of course, was incredibly impressed also by the different sets of research groups that you have established, the variety of topics that you are dealing with. And that eventually was after I had already created this slide, and then I feel so embarrassed because whatever is marked here on the slide is like taking old to Athens. Well, why is it that we are concerned, particularly now in the realm of my research project, particularly about economic inequality? It's first that really struck me many, many years ago when I started working on this topic is that the objective, what is happening, objectively speaking, is not necessarily what is really catching up very neatly with people's individuals' perceptions. We also are confronted with problems of measurement of perceptions, but this is certainly something that is extending to a variety of different research realms. We are surprised that the rational assumption that when there is a lot of inequality, there should be a lot of demands for redistribution is not necessarily what we expect on the ground. And I mean, you can hear it. I have neither a British nor a French accent. I'm a German citizen and coming from a conservative welfare regime with moderate levels of economic inequality, if you will, living now in France with similar levels of economic inequality and also with a comparable welfare regime. But looking at welfare regimes such as Sweden, so the social democratic ones, and particularly also comparing attitudes and perceptions with welfare regimes where income inequality is particularly pronounced, like in Great Britain, certainly is something that we have also kind of discovered in the data that we have collected so far. So clearly this is something that is something that drives political scientists, I believe, quite for some bit. Now, this kind of led me to, in terms of the research project that I had applied for already quite a number of years ago, and that I was lucky enough that I received the fundings from the ERC at that time, really to ask under which circumstances would really perceptions of economic inequality be politically salient, and salient meaning like when is it that maybe attitudes are being impacted, when political behavior is being impacted, but not necessarily in doing something against it or in favor of it, but even becoming apathetic, if you will, or not mentioning it at all can also be a political purpose. So of course that means that thinking about politicization really is demanding going beyond what we may usually think about. But it was in this rather larger context that I was thinking about the politicization of economic inequality and under which specific circumstances would it emerge or not. And my research project is guided by 3 different levels of analysis, if you will. There is the micro level where my hypotheses, well, it's not only mine, but I kind of lend from that the perception of economic inequality is not something that is just cognitive, but it is also kind of influenced at the very same time by the values, by the distributive justice norms that we hold. Then we are also in a context where economic inequality is politicized by different actors and by different contexts. And I'm going to show you in a moment what specifically I'm thinking about here. And then, of course, the macro level, and that is where my assumption of the relevance of the welfare regime kicks in. Here's the idea that these regimes, the different institutional setups that come with it, are also promoting different social norms that are shared by the majority of society. Now, trying to condense this on one slide, if you will, that was my attempt at least. Like, this would be my core interest, if you will, the perceptions of economic inequality, and they should be strongly associated and impacted by individually held norms of distributive justice. But of course, this also needs to consider a variety of other individual level indicators, such as personality traits, values, socio-demographics, social networks, political ideology, and political knowledge. And I'm particularly also interested in looking with regard to these interactions here that are assumed, what the impact would be on emotions, attitudes, and preferences, and then eventually social and political behavior. And this kind of framing, if you will, is contextualized by the procedure or processes of what I call politicization. And yet you will see that I'm not very decided. Is it that I'm talking about politicization or representation thereof? So now our working terminology is rather representation of economic inequality, and whether it is then politicized or not is then certainly also an empirical question that kind of falls back to this part here. But we are here in this contextual part, particularly interested in elites discourse, media frames being used when economic inequality is addressed, and then also, of course, political decisions, but also information that is circling out there. And again, here, if you see here, the socialization idea would be the societal norms of distributive justice resulting from welfare regime institutions. And maybe just as a kind of excuse, of course, the assumption are prototypical welfare regimes, knowing that lots of welfare retrenchment has taken place in the past 30 years. What has been prototypical conservative welfare regimes in the past isn't anymore. Now I'm talking about particularly Germany and France, for instance. And also you could also observe a lot of changes even in social democratic welfare regimes such as Sweden, particularly also when it comes to the increase in economic inequality in the 1990s and 2000s. Now, and the beauty of these research projects that are funded by the ERC is the duration. So usually these projects are funded for over 5 years. And that, of course, gives you the possibility to think larger. And the largest here that I have kind of developed is reflected in these 5 work packages, some of which have already been concluded, others are still underway. And the first work package here that I had conceptualized was particularly looking at how is it, what kind of heuristics and shortcuts would people really mobilize when they are giving you answers to what they think about the level of inequality in their country. I guess that many of you are also working a lot with survey data, and the regular items that are being used in international surveys are, do you think that differences in income are too large? Or there are also other questions like, do you think that income inequality is fair or unfair? So you are expecting from your participants answers, and you get answers, right? It doesn't seem to be a particularly difficult question to answer. And that is maybe also kind of reflected in the limited number of missing values. But personally, I always was very, well, kept questioning what exactly is it that people are basing their judgment on. If we think that it's not only perception, merely cognitive, if you will, but it's kind of enmeshed with a number of different assessments. And that is what VP1 was supposed to do. Really being very exploratory, if you will. I'm going to delve into this in a moment. And then work package 2 is the part where we are focusing on the elites discourse. So how is economic inequality, but also redistribution represented? And here, so far, we have mainly focused on political party programs in our 3 countries, right? And VP3 is currently under preparation. We also try to refer to our insights collected from VP2. And that is also something that we are going to address briefly. VP4 actually is our attempt then to connect the kind of the findings that we have collected here and also the frames that we have discovered here with survey data, right? And so far we have collected survey data in Great Britain and in France. Sweden is going to be collected in a few weeks from now. And here, mostly we were interested in the media consumption pattern, really trying to tease out what is it specifically that people are consuming and whether or not these consumption patterns are associated with different attitudes towards inequality and redistribution. And here we expect that we can nicely connect. Well, we will see whether it works out or not. But in addition to this, we have also devoted quite a large chunk of questions on different types of emotions elicited by different types of inequality. We have not yet focused so much on distributive justice evaluations. Actually, I'm considering fielding yet another set of population surveys in these 3 countries where we can combine the insights from here, from there, and then be a little bit more focused also in terms of distributive justice evaluations and specifically also public policies that are not reflected in this one here. And then last but not least, because eventually if you cannot prove any kind of causality, you are always prone to heavy criticisms. I mean, even if you can, you are prone to heavy criticisms, but this is the attempt kind of convince also the scientific community of what we may have found here and here is really something that reflects eventually also in the attitudes of people and emotions, if you will. This is also something that is still under construction and in preparation. Oh yeah, okay, thank you. Sorry. Okay, I'm already way above the time, but we have 15 minutes more, we were told. Right, so I'm going to talk about the work package 1, and then Daniel, who is in charge of work package 2 and work package 3, is going to discuss what we have done and the major findings here. Now, the guiding research questions were, as I already mentioned, how is it or how would people assess economic inequality? And you see, maybe you also, you were wondering, why is it that I'm using the term economic inequality? That's not a term that people are used to use also in common parlance. But for me, this is kind of well, a tool, if you will, to embrace both income and wealth inequality. So I did not, from the outset, did not want to decide on either of both. We know that, for instance, in Sweden, wealth inequality is pretty important, while it is less relevant in Great Britain. while income inequality is more relevant in Great Britain and so on. So that is why I prefer choosing this term in order to be a little bit more encompassing in this regard. Now, asking participants about the sources and the cognitive shortcuts that they would use. So is it more based on observations, or are they rather basing their perceptions on information, on media reports, for instance, statistical data, but also politicians, for instance. And then at the last level, what we also did, how we operationalized our VP1 was we were developing an interview guide which was really repetitive. So boring, if you will, but really repetitive, with always the same question. So, and the trick was that we went from the neighborhood level to the city level, to the region level, and then to the country level. And we really thought that people will be so surprised by the initial questions. Probably nobody has ever come across a situation where they would be asked, which kind of shortcuts do you use if you want to assess the inequality at your neighborhood, right? So we have all been thinking about inequality in our country or in the regions, but inequality in our neighborhood, I think this is rather uncommon. So we really wanted to go from the rather uncommon and reach higher levels, and really wanted to tease out whether different heuristics would pop up at different levels of personal proximity. It was really repetitive. Some criticized it, well, this is boring, but then we also wanted to control for different answers that may have been given, because the interview guide would have allowed for some flexibility. So that's why we were very strict in asking always the same question. Now, the focus group, they fell, of course, in the midst of the COVID pandemic. So initially we wanted to conduct them like regular focus groups, but this was not possible. And by the time we really got our stuff together, online focus groups had already kind of established. So there were some companies that already had some experiences, knew a little bit what the fallouts would be and how really to moderate these kinds of focus groups. So eventually all went well, but this was quite a challenge at the beginning. And what we did was to conduct 8 focus groups per country from December 21 to February 22, 8 per country, with an average of 6 participants per group and a duration of 90 minutes. And these focus groups were moderated by representatives of Kantar, Quality. I think they have changed names. So they were the ones who did it. And we had 3 pilot groups being fielded beforehand. We also tried to control for social influence that may emerge or be present in socially heterogeneous versus socially homogeneous groups. So we were also constructing groups that were rather homogeneous, and we were also constructing groups that were rather heterogeneous, as much as it was possible, right? And all in all, eventually we had 145 participants. I think I already mentioned what we were doing there. I don't want to repeat myself. Maybe this one, because it's really relevant. Amongst others, we were also asking the participants what they feel about economic inequality, right? When they are thinking about that. And I think this was quite telling. I'm going to show you a few examples of responses in a moment. And another thing which was very important also for us for VP4, when we constructed our regular survey and we wanted to measure the emotions that are associated with the perception of inequality, because that was also something that was not so clear from the beginning. We implemented a very short survey before the focus group discussion and immediately thereafter, right? So that kind of allowed us also to ask a few other questions. We also had open questions on what people are thinking of when they are thinking of inequality. But eventually, the questions on emotions that we have also implemented here were very helpful then in the next stage. Going to hurry up a little bit. Now, here are just a few examples of inequality cues at the neighborhood level. And what was interesting was that there were some common indicators like housing conditions in all three countries. People also often used cars as heuristics and clothing, but sometimes they would also mention, well, you do not really know whether it's a reliable indicator. Maybe people would also have taken up credits and financed it and are highly indebted. You don't know. So it was mentioned as this with this as well. And then private and public services like schools and healthcare, but also things like noise, cleanliness, street conditions, and public green spaces. And then we had some observations that were rather country specific, like in France and in Sweden, we had quite a number of participants that would not necessarily see income differences in their immediate surrounding. Right? That was striking because in the British case, this was exactly the opposite. Right? You had a sense like people in Great Britain, they go out of their door. I mean, je caricature, I'm just exaggerating now, but it was like, wow, you go out of your door and you're immediately kind of confronted with signs and cues of quite considerable inequality. But in the French and in the Swedish case, this was not the case in the neighborhood. And then in France and in Great Britain, the number of diversity of restaurants and shops were also mentioned more often in these two countries than in Sweden. Now, one example of the emotions that also gives you a little bit of an overview of the emotions that were mentioned, but also what the contexts are. Interestingly, often anger, sadness, frustration, helplessness, and powerlessness were mentioned in this open discussion setting. I'm going to wrap it up now. All right. And from a political participation research point of view, I would argue that most of these emotions are not drivers for political action. Some of them are, but certainly not when you feel powerless. You are not going to be the person next in the street in order to demonstrate for more redistribution. This is a strong claim of mine. Of course, it's an empirical issue, but that would have been my impression. Now, in one example from Norbert de France, he would say it pisses me off. So very strong in a social setting, right? In this kind of focus group setting. It pissed me off to see people like that in this day and age. We're not in the Middle Ages anymore. We make money in our country. There are people who drive a Tesla. Well, and there are other people who eat sandwiches. Well, who asked for, well, sandwich in France. Sandwich in France is something which I saw. Well, a sandwich in France, I have a different sorry for this cultural translation. Well, who asked for a sandwich? It drives me crazy when I see that. I'm sorry. And then in Sweden, on the other hand, there is a lady who says there is frustration and irritation then too. Some people who really need help don't get help. Then some people slip through society and get help that others would have gotten more easily. So here it's a bit more about cheating, right? So you have pretty strong emotions, but it's not necessarily directed at the rich or at the government. It's really about those who cheat the system. And then in Great Britain, one example, it is said that you feel that you can't help, right? So you can feel, you see, okay, this lady maybe is disenchanted. So you have this sense of resignation, disenchantment, that inequality would never be overcome. And in the focus groups, eventually you would also hear that you cannot do anything about that. It had always been like this. So that was indeed something that you heard. And then to come to a conclusion, inequalities in income and wealth are perceived to be problematic in all three countries. So that is something that we were also finding. Individuals are able to perceive inequalities, even if it's not necessarily in the immediate environment, such as in France and in Sweden. they would also often use mental shortcuts that are rather indirectly related with economic inequality. And the Swedish case was very interesting that came up when we were asking about the city level. In Sweden, vandalism and crime was regularly mentioned as a reflection of inequality. Again, we were asking the very same question. This was neither the case in Great Britain nor in France. It was in Sweden. And then expressed emotional states are not necessarily conducive to political action. Well, this is a very strong claim that I'm putting in front of you. And what was also relevant, and that was the first time that we really saw that in our data, that the absence of expressed feelings towards the rich was pretty remarkable. So really a sense of indifference, right? So what is it that you feel? Well, I don't care, right? I'm fine. I don't care. Okay, so I've talked 25 minutes.
It's okay though.
So now it's Daniel's turn.
Hello. So I'm going to talk to you today about how the economic inequality and redistribution is represented in elite political communication. And part of this is, as Sonja laid out, all of our work packages sort of overlap in some way. And so you're trying to take inspiration from both the focus groups and our later work packages and see if we can try to get closer to a causal explanation. But so you have this idea of there is indifference, frustration, you're seeing it slightly differently in different countries. So it's more apparent in the neighborhood in the UK, whereas not in France and Sweden. And now we're asking, well, if we're looking at this in political communication, is this thing being represented in a different way? Potentially, is this why they are viewing it accordingly? And so it's not that we haven't seen across Europe in our three countries any political action on this. Whereas in France, you actually have seen year-long protests who have focused on issues of economic inequality as part of it. But France actually, since over the last period, has actually had relatively stable levels of economic inequality. The UK, in comparison, especially following the global financial crash, has had significant increases in economic inequality, but you haven't seen this, the matched political mobilization on the issue. So maybe there's something in what is being offered by the political parties and the way that it's being constructed in this context that is not filtering down into something that people would mobilize behind. And part of the way, so we have this comparative research project, we're looking at it in three countries, so Sweden, France, and the UK. And we're suggesting that potentially something about the welfare regime that they have, this potentially maintains some sort of normative basis to it, that it's not just like economic inequality is right or wrong, but it's actually quite particular to these types of countries, the reasons why it is wrong and what sort of things that you would demand. For example, in the UK, when you often typically focus on elements of need, especially individual need, comparative elements that go into economic inequality, because you are comparing in virtue, maybe that is not something of prime consideration, but actually something that might be normalized and so wouldn't necessarily be politicized in the same way. Cool. But part of this is it's very difficult to, you get different answers depending on how you do your research, which shouldn't come as a big surprise. So we have our data set. We wanted to cover the period from the global financial crash to the modern day. We are looking at this in national elections. So in the UK, we're looking at this in general party manifestos. In France, French presidential election, and in Sweden, the Reichstag parliamentary platforms, which happen around every 5 years, 2 to 5 years. But the way that we're approaching the analysis is qualitative and quantitative and qualitative. And part of the reason that we do this thematic analysis on it is we are very concerned about just looking at the idea that people translate economic inequality. Economic inequality is not a word people tend to use in everyday parlance. As Sonja introduced, you had, like, in the British context, this immediacy of economic inequality. And when you looked at the transcripts, one person described it as it's cheek and jaw. Like, that is the sort of language that if you did a keyword search on economic inequality, is metaphorical, it's meaningful to people, but it's not necessarily going to come up in your results. On the other hand, we want to be focusing on when economic inequality specifically as words become salient. is that sort of which parties are using them? And also we are looking at in these 3 countries, what are they connecting that to redistributive functions of their welfare state? So for example, in the UK, when you're talking about economic inequality, are you also talking about universal credit or job seekers allowance? And so this is just the purely qualitative aspect to it. And what we find is there is actually quite a strongly different normative basis for how you're making sense of how you're representing in political communication economic inequality. This doesn't mean that there's consensus across these countries, but the basis of how you would say that economic inequality is right or wrong, or what you would be claiming should be done, is actually quite different between them. So in the UK, you tend to focus on the individual, and that is sort of the unit of analysis. So for example, in a university context, you would often, when we're talking about marking, we focus on marking individuals because that is part of like a meritocratic belief that you mark them, and then this is where the distribution would come up. That is not the same degree that comes up in France. So in France, you have a much greater focus on what is like the social order and what is the role of companies that in maintaining this. So if economic inequality is seen as destabilizing to some degree, it's seen as somewhat of a threat. The issue would then be these partnerships that are not performing. So you have bad actors that are ensuring that economic inequality does not come up. So for example, you extend to all companies the obligation to adopt a company plan or agreement against pay or career inequalities. Sweden, on the other hand, is quite interesting because whereas in the UK, the individual is a given, in Sweden is much more, I know myself as an individual through my embeddedness in society. I am born into society, and this allows me the capability to be an individual. So you sort of have this idea that like you want to lay the foundations for a fair society that holds together. And we must take full responsibility for how things go here in Sweden. So now I'm going to look at some of the quantitative data. And so even though you're seeing these things being representative in quite different ways, that doesn't, like I said, doesn't mean consensus on it. And so you actually see quite large changes within countries of which parties are talking about it. So we have, these are frequency scores of the number of times economic inequality and its near others are being used in party programs in these 3 countries. And you see in the UK compared to France, it is less of a feature overall. Like there is a greater amount across the political spectrum of attention given in France than the UK. But when you look at the UK, it doesn't seem to be particularly directly relating to a national level indicator like the Gini coefficient in a way that you might expect, but instead potentially speaks to something more for when you are speaking about it is more for political gain. So you see this quite clearly within the Labour Party, what's traditionally the centre-left dominant party in the UK. You see this huge spike. It's relatively stable as a low feature between 2005 to 2015, but then really spikes with its change of leadership between 2015 and 2017 and 2019 manifestos. But as they're expecting to go back into government, this goes away.
A quick question.
Yeah.
Where is this Gini coefficient?
Sonja,
do you know where the Gini coefficient?
It's an official data set that we
There are lots of official data sets that say completely different things from one. You don't know which one it is.
I would know if I am looking at my paper. We have
Later.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
Thank you.
Is it that you think that the Gini data is not very?
No, I just wonder where it came from.
Okay, so we can look it up in a moment.
Sure. But there's something in the UK that potentially is being done for political gain, especially you also see this in the SNP. It spikes at the time of the referendum as a way of criticizing the dominant party. In France, to a greater degree, it is less variable in who is speaking about it, but there's something suggestive in the data that maybe the more hard left and hard right parties seem to actually move quite a lot in parallel. And again, the left and right also move in parallel, and then the center sort of doesn't really necessarily, is quite variable in the way that they approach it. So maybe there's something in the relationship between who you see as your competitive political party and who is speaking about economic inequality. So now we've also so we have the same semantics on economic inequality, but we are also looking at the frequency of references to elements of the welfare state that have an influence on redistribution. And whereas in France, you see actually quite consistent patterns within parties of when they're speaking about economic inequality, there's also a relative change in talking about redistribution. And that maybe is because sort of when it's much closer to this focus on the company and potentially less of an issue of representation than of individual representation. Whereas in the UK, you can see these huge spikes that don't necessarily move in parallel between talking about economic inequality and redistribution. For example, in the Labour Party, economic inequality remains relatively stable until 2015, but you are really talking about the redistributive features. And you also find this inverse pattern within the Conservative Party. Okay, so implications of what we've had so far is there's something suggestive in it that maybe the way the norms ingrained within the country's welfare regime type relates to how economic inequality is represented. We find that in France, in these economic inequality has a greater focus than the UK, which you would expect in a conservative to a need-based welfare regime type. But there is seems to be something particular about France, whereas the prominence of redistributive features moves to a much greater degree in parallel with the salience of economic inequality. Yet it doesn't necessarily obviously speak to political orientation, as you see actually quite a lot of variabilities across parties and orientation, such that something may be politicized on economic inequality and then depoliticized depending on the political aims of the party at this time. Okay, so we've looked at a little bit in elite political communication, and now I'm going to talk about how we're also going to address it in the media. So overall aim, examine the explicit and implicit representations concerning economic inequality redistribution and these distributive justice principles in the media discourse in France, the UK, and Sweden over between 2000 and 2024. And what we really want to get on this is a set of corpuses that can go across a long time span, but also be able to be responsive to the different media formats that you could have economic inequality and redistribution represented within. For that reason, so we're looking at using Nexus and Nexus News Desk, which is great for digital and print news media archives to try to go for a longer period, but this does restrict you to more traditional media types and also becomes a lot more textual. We've also employed TV Eyes, which just gives us on a rolling basis for 3 months. But it's really nice because you can also get where is economic inequality in podcasts, where is it in YouTube, and where is it in like TV news. And these elements also, when Sonja talks later on about our survey, are trying to we will also be looking at who is actually watching these programs. So hopefully we can put it a little bit more together. And also drawing on the previous research, we are looking at economic inequality as words that people use as deliberative, but also trying to be attentive to more the ways that people might make sense of it. For example, focusing on particular groups. So in the UK, why you might look at taxpayers versus elites versus social beneficiaries, and using to get the more political spectrum, both more pejorative language and or more socially acceptable language that goes into it, being quite attentive to lots of these debates come out over particular policies. So using universal credit as an example for that might be something that we would search on, and also looking for that more moralized language. So when people talk about fairness, responsibility, as well as just economic inequality as terms themselves. So this is currently in development, and we're going to be hopefully doing this in the 3 countries.
So we are left with 5 more minutes, so I'm going to try to be as quick as possible. I'm taking you a little bit to some insights that we have collected based on our population surveys, representative online surveys they were, in France and Great Britain, as I already mentioned, and Sweden. Actually, Sweden has not been collected because we needed the ethics approval by a specific Swedish committee beforehand. And because we had the general elections right in front of us in both countries, they were unforeseen. We had to be very, very, very quick in France and in Great Britain. And for the Swedes, we said, okay, we're going to do this when we have collected the other data. So that explains why Sweden had not been integrated here. So as I already mentioned, the media consumption pattern is something that has really been collected in depth based on this data, but we were also trying to get more insights into the universe of emotions, of which we had already some ideas and clues based on the focus group data that we had collected. Now, what is it that we did? We had an N of 6,000, so 3,000 per country. And we separated each survey into 4 modules, because what we wanted to find out was whether people's elicited emotions towards income inequality and wealth inequality, for instance, would differ. And this also based on representative samples. So for each of this module here, we had 1,500. But in addition to this, and that definitely was based on our focus group insights, we also wanted to test whether elicited emotions, when people were being asked about their emotions when they think of poor people or when they think of rich people, would differ from people's elicited emotions when they think of social beneficiaries or taxpayers, for instance, right? So that's what we really try to get a better understanding of. And we did this also then based on the very same modules C and D that were initially asked about wealth inequality. So that's why it's a little bit structured into 4 parts, if you will. Now, why should we really care about emotions and economic inequality? It's also based on previous research that has found that emotions play a critical role in shaping people's support for policies that address inequality or that address to seek to reduce poverty. Recent research also by Garcia Castro has particularly shown the relevant role of moral outrage as an important predictor in this regard. We are not so sure how really to define moral outrage, and we understand this is really something where we still need to do some work, because to differentiate moral outrage from anger, it's not so clear-cut, but clearly in the data we see that there are differences, so certainly something that we need to delve more into. And then interestingly, when you are looking at the research done on poverty attribution, for instance, what is being discovered that negative emotions such as anger and aggression towards people in poverty are dominant when poverty is attributed to factors perceived or assumingly perceived to be controlled by the person in poverty, which includes laziness or lack of willingness to really go work, for instance. By contrast, positive emotions are dominant when poverty is attributed to external factors that are out of the control of individual. And here it's, well, I hope this is not too small. What you can see here are 8 emotions that we have collected on a scale running from 1 to 5. So each and every participant was asked whether they would feel anger, sadness, compassion, frustration, admiration, indifference, or contentment, or moral outrage when they think of income inequality, when they think of wealth inequality, poor people, rich people, social beneficiaries, and taxpayers. And the red one is the British results, and the blue one is the French results. So grosso modo, I think what you can kind of guess or get from a first impression here is that emotions elicited by the stimuli of income or wealth are not very different from each other, and that even with across the 2 countries, you would think that there are differences, certainly, but not striking to that extent. Personally, what I found interesting was that if you look at the emotions elicited by the crime of poor people, you certainly would have lots of people who express sadness and compassion, but not necessarily so when you are juxtaposing them with social beneficiaries, right? I mean, maybe I'm too naive, but I would assume that when you're living from the social benefits, you are a poor person. But this, in the eyes of the beholder or in the hearts of the participants, this is not necessarily the case. And then looking at this kind of the rich people, what I already mentioned, what we found pretty striking is the level of indifference that is resented or not resented, is expressed towards people who are rich. And I would argue from a political participation point of view, when you are indifferent towards maybe a specific group of people, that is not very politicizing, I guess. So, but who am I? Now, I think I am really going to be very, very brief now here. What we did then in the next step was to see how these elicited emotions are associated with redistributive preferences. And what we used here is a very often used item in the ISSP, for instance, in other surveys where you are being asked whether you think that the government should cut taxes and also cut social benefits, or whether taxes should increase and social benefits should also increase. So that is this kind of the scale running from 1 to 10, where you have these two extremes. And what we do see here, again, it's income and wealth, it's poor and social beneficiaries, and it's rich and the taxpayers in Great Britain here and in France there, is that moral outrage really seems to be quite relevant in this regard. And there are not necessarily very strong coefficients that are associated with the rich people, at least not in Great Britain. In France, this is slightly different, but grosso modo, I would say here the social beneficiaries is a group that is worth it looking a little bit more closely compared to the poor one, because you see that there are a mixed box of emotions going into different directions, if you will. There are cross-country similarities, but also some differences that play out here. Some conclusions: perceptions of income inequality and wealth inequality do hardly differ from each other, at least based on what we have seen here. But the emotions that are elicited are rather comparable. But the emotions elicited by primes of poor people and social beneficiaries depict differences. And the latter eliciting less sadness and less compassion and more indifference. Emotions towards the rich elicit the highest degree of indifference here. Right, and the other things I have already kind of briefly mentioned. Now, super briefly here, taking you to the framing experiment, which is now under development. What we would like to do is to conduct randomized control trials in our 3 countries, where we would like to develop 10 different sets, or say frames, that we are constructing based on the insights of our VP2, VP3, and VP4, and really see whether the frames that we are constructing are going to impact on some attitudes that we have collected in VP4. And our main insight so far, but this is the very last slide, thanks for your patience. From this vantage point now, I would say that subjective versus objective inequality, clearly there are divergences, but this does not come as a surprise to none of us, of course, between actual levels of economic inequality and how people perceive them would often arise from personal experiences, observations, and the broader political and societal influences. We also have observed varied emotional responses. So inequality can take multiple forms. We have not even talked about social inequality here. And that is also very difficult really to distinguish from some expressions of economic inequality. Yet they do not elicit the same emotional reactions, ranging from anger and sadness to powerlessness and frustration. We would also underline the psychology and the awareness which is at stake here. Recognizing and interpreting inequality is a dynamic, identity-shaping process, influenced also by social comparisons, rather than a simple acceptance or rejection of factual information. And then last but not least here, distributive justice norms, so conceptions of right or wrong and what deserves political focus are shaped, in part at least, by welfare state principles and their embedded ideas of distributive fairness. And at that point, I thank you so much for your attention, for being with us, and for all the questions maybe that you're being asked. And I'm so sorry for...
No, thank you for the great presentation. It's an amazing amount of material, and I know it's relevant to the work that people do. So we have some time for questions now from the room. Also online, if you're online, you can raise your hand or post a question in the chat stating your name and affiliation if possible. So we might take a round of questions to try and collect as many reactions as possible. So I can start.
Hi, it's maybe a bit naive question, but I'm interested in, maybe you have done it. How do you define the politicization? And what would be also interesting to see, what do people do with those feelings next? Do they vote for right? Do they vote for left? Do they stay in the middle?
So we might just take a round of questions just to try and cover some ground. Yes.
Yeah, so hi, thank you very much for your presentation, very interesting. So I was just thinking about, like, at least in the case of France, that there's this huge like heterogeneity in the people who are social beneficiaries. Like, so I was wondering if you could give maybe more information on how to define it, or if that explains your results. I mean, it's not the same thing for someone who is at the top decile and currently just touching an unemployment benefit, who will maybe feel indifferent to that, to someone who is very depressed and is taking the RSA, like this allowance of like never being employed, so they have very different in terms of the scale and in terms of their attitudes toward the distribution or inequality in general.
Take those two questions.
Okay, so thanks. I'm not so sure I really got yours, but I'm going to come back to you in a second. Now, the politicization thing is this is how I started out, right? And that is also in the title of my project. But again, if you see in the title of the presentation, I'm not mentioning politicization at all. I'm talking about representation. And actually, whether it is politicizing or not is, in my view at least, then something that comes as a consequence. That is how I would interpret it, and may then result in eliciting different types of emotions. But then last but not least, what we are really interested in is whether it's going to change political action on the ground. Voting is one kind of participation, but depending also a little bit on the country where you're living in and the tradition. I mean, I have been living in France now long enough to know that demonstrations are really kind of part and parcel also of the political culture. That's interesting. And you would even know when the demonstrations would take place at the beginning of the new academic year, which is in September, right? So that is really kind of the political culture structure. And I certainly will need to come back to this politicization thing. Maybe I'm a little bit too lazy at this point, right? That I kind of lean on the representation thing, so I cannot do much wrong. But it is in the focus of the research project, actually, really finding out what are the reactions to that. And that is also one of the reasons why I thought that this VP5 is essential, because that's where I really want to test whether different frames of representations of inequality have an impact of different attitudes and emotions. That, of course, I will not be able to test action, and I will not know how long it may last. But that is clearly, this is clearly core. And right now I try to circumvent that. And I'm not sure whether I really got you said with regard to France and the perception of social beneficiaries, whether this can be explained by what? Again, say it again.
But I mean, how it depends on how you're defining someone being a social beneficiary, right? It's just receiving an employment support or receiving, or if you're at the lower levels, because people can be of high income in general and just be receiving social aid at one point. And so that can explain what kind of social aid you're receiving in.
No, it is certainly, when it is used in common parlance, it has a rather pejorative note. And that is also reflected in the emotions that are elicited.
It's a good question. So we do in our survey have a question about, are you personally in receipt of different forms of social benefits. So we haven't actually looked at that data. Not from France, but from especially the US, one thing that is very common in the media is actually you have quite singular representations of social beneficiaries. So I entirely get that actually your personal differences in sort of the types of receipts that you have theoretically should change what your representation is. Often, at least in liberal countries, there's one singular focus that tends to be particularly focused on unemployment benefits. So whilst you do have these differentiation, they may not necessarily, when you're asking people, be something that people relate to. The other part is, even when you, especially in the US, when you ask people what their recommendations for how they would speak to somebody on social beneficiaries, even if they themselves are, they would still sort of give narratives around, I would encourage them to work hard, I would encourage them not to be dependent. And so whilst theoretically you would expect a higher degree of coherence or like rationality to it, part of our project is examining whether that actually comes about in reality, but that's not something that we've looked at in the data thoroughly yet.
Right.
So it's a good question.
Very briefly, looking at the data, because the share of the respondents saying they're living on social benefits is around 10 or 20%. So we allowed them to give up to 100%, but it's if at all, because I think it's something like 60% that say no, but if at all, it's rather marginal. But we have not looked at associations.
So this may be our last round of questions. So if you have something on your mind, now is the time to put your hand up. Chico.
Thanks. Just two quick questions. One on emotions. Do you worry about social desirability biases when people are responding, sort of Hawthorne effects, pleasing the interviewer? I may feel a bit bothered by wealth inequality, but if you ask me, do you feel moral outrage? I'll say yes, I'll feel moral outrage. And it sounds like the right thing to feel, doesn't it? And I mean, this is a real thing, obviously. So, social desirability bias in surveys and questionnaires. People try to elicit emotions by doing other things, filming people and then having other people hold their reactions. So that kind of methodological question. And then the other one sounds a bit facetious, but I don't mean it to be facetious in effect.
I'm lucky I don't understand. What do you
Well, it's just to say, the results you had on neighborhood inequality, perceptions of neighborhood inequalities between the UK, the differences between the UK and France and Sweden. This has come up. I just wonder if you've considered London and many cities in the UK, unlike Stockholm and Paris, were bombed very heavily. And the fact that they were bombed very heavily in the war meant that a lot of housing estates were built in the middle of rich neighborhoods. This is a real thing. Now, whether it accounts for the whole explanation, I don't know. But it is something that Londoners will very often experience. So I just wonder whether you've thought about this, or it may not be the whole answer, but I wonder whether it's there at all.
Thanks for asking this question. I'm going to look up. I've never thought about this. With regard to the social desirability, actually, we were surprised, if you allow me, a little bit about the opposite, particularly in the focus groups, right? In these online focus groups, that people, you saw one of these examples, they were very frank in expressing how frustrated they were, right? So if you believe in, social desirability, of course, is a relevant thing, but the fact that in this kind of very open context, people would really express emotions that usually you would also think that that you would prefer not to express them, because you may not want to really expose yourself in such a setting. But having said that, when it comes to the survey, actually we were asking all 8 emotions all the time, and if this was a social desirable thing, I think we would see similar emotions with regard to different groups. But that is not necessarily what we found. Like moral outrage would differ across these different groups and also across the different countries. and the indifference things. I think that is something that I carried with me. This indifference towards the rich. I found this is telling. Again, I always have this political action person in the back of my mind and thinking, okay, is it going to lead to more political participation eventually or not? What are the reasons why people would not make louder demands? And maybe there is something to it where the emotions or this level of indifference may also play into that. And with regard to the composition of the focus groups, actually, we really tried to collect participants from all across the country. So of course, we had a lot of Londoners there, but we also had people from Manchester, Liverpool, Scotland. And so it was really, that was our attempt to try to represent it in such a way that the entire country would be reflected. So London being bombed, and that this is reflective and also of the architecture. I'm not sure whether this really has kind of a repercussion on our focus group data, at least. I would hope not. And the same also for France and for Sweden. We also tried to gather as many people from over the country. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, sorry, no.
My part of my job as chair, I'm afraid, is to cut things off when the time elapses. So that's all we have time for today.
Sure.
But thank you so much for the brilliant presentation. Thank you all for being here. A quick administrative point. Please, for people in the room, just leave your plates and cups exactly where they are when you get up. That's actually the most helpful thing to do. And we look forward to seeing
We are
you.
still around. I don't know whether.
Absolutely. We can continue the discussion here for anyone who has the energy, which I'm sure most of us do. So otherwise, thank you, Sonja.
Thank you so much.